when you think of rivalries, there's some obvious choices. Tom Brady and Peyton Manning on the gridiron, Boston Red Sox and the Yankees, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, and of course, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But how about the world of modern art? Do artists like Manet and Degas, Picasso and Matisse, Pollock and de Kooning, or Freud and Bacon come to mind? The intersection of creative genius, friendship, and tension, and its impact on their work is the central thesis of The Art of Rivalry, a new book by the Boston Globe's Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic, Sebastian Smee. And joining me is the author, Sebastian Smee. It's great to meet you, Sebastian. I wanted to meet you for a long time. I should have read the whole title because it really tells the story. The Art of Rivalry, 4 friendships, betrayals, and breakthroughs in modern art. What prompted this exercise?
Well, you know, I was lucky to get to know one of the artists in this book, Lucian Freud. He was getting old by then, but I was living in London, and I became aware that he'd had this relationship with Francis Bacon way back in the 50s and 60s, but they'd fallen out, and I was sort of led to believe it was dangerous even to raise the subject. So I knew something pretty explosive had gone on, but I finally did, and the story I got was, I found it really moving. It made me realize that a lot of these rivalries aren't sort of these big sort of, fist fights, enemies slugging it out, but in fact, there's a more intimate story to tell.
And your thesis is, which you proved pretty well, is that in their greatness, or at least some of their breakthroughs, are attributable to the intimate rivalries, if that's not oxymoronic.
Yeah.
So are you also saying that they might not have been as great had they not? I mean, would Picasso not have been Picasso?
I think there's no doubt. I mean, it sounds...
No doubt that he would not have been?
I really believe that Matisse was an absolutely key force on making Picasso Picasso. In all these stories, I'm focused on the early periods in both artists' careers. And in each case, one of them is a little bit ahead of the other. So Matisse, people forget this because they think sort of Picasso was the one who ended up being the greatest. And they might love Matisse, but he's this sort of big figure. But early on, Matisse was definitely ahead, and he was getting the attention of the collectors and the critics. And he didn't even realize for a while that he was in a kind of fight with Picasso. It's like a mentor-protege relationship.
Tell the story about the African mask, which I just love.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that early modern art becomes known for is that it becomes very interested in art from other cultures, and African masks is one of those things. And you get a lot of distortion of form and a kind of primitive look, primitive in inverted commas. And it was actually Matisse who was the first to sort of discover these masks in a curio shop in Paris. And he brings, one of them back to the Steins. He's telling Gertrude Stein all about it. And Picasso rocks up, and he's like, "What's this?" And Matisse then, very in his sort of professorial way, explains everything about them. And before you know it, Picasso's gone off, and he's been working on this huge masterpiece, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and he goes ahead and changes some of the figures in that painting, which is now, the key painting of the 20th century, so that they have these African masks in them. So Matisse must have been, what the hell?
Some people are crushed when there are these kinds of rivalries. Some people grow, and you talked about those who grow. What does it say about these men that they weren't brought down by these rivalries?
That's a great question, and I always think of something Matisse said. He said, I would always have, I said, I've never avoided the influence of others. He said, I would have felt it a cowardice and a lack of sincerity toward myself if I'd done that. And he felt that the artist's personality can prove itself through these relationships that really test you. And he really was tested by Picasso, and not just at this time, but later on as well. But their friendship sort of went in and out, and they were very close at times, and they relaxed about the rivalry. But early on, I think it was really dramatic.
You mentioned the man Freud, and by the way, he's related to the Freud.
He's the grandson of Sigmund Freud. Yeah.
So, and I assume is he the one you met? I mean, you didn't meet Degas, who died.
No.
Okay,
Bacon also was already dead.
Speaking of, when Marjorie Egan and I interviewed Doris Kearns Goodwin right after Team of Rivals came out, and I remember asking her, so you spent 10 years on this thing. Do you feel like you know Abraham Lincoln? And I don't mean know about him, but know him. And she said, yeah, I do feel. Do you feel like you know these men? Not just, what I mean. Do you know?
I mean, you have to be careful, that not to presume to sort of, you can identify with your subjects, and you can presume to know too much, I think. But, what was amazing for me was that even with Freud, who I felt that I knew well, and I'd heard all the stories and I'd read all the books, I learned a lot about him that I had no idea about. I mean, he's famous for having, lots of lovers, and ended up with 13 kids by the time he died. But
what's the story about the wedding he couldn't go to?
Well, this is the thing. He'd had, a few. He was in a circle of of gay men early on, and he actually had a couple of relationships, which I didn't realize. I thought that was fascinating to learn. But yeah, he went to a wedding. It was, you know, this famous post-war party in Britain, and it was a wedding party that went over 3 days. So he just felt he couldn't go because he'd actually had, you know, amorous relations with the, you know, the bride, the groom, and bizarrely, the groom's mother. So
You missed the grandmother to quote Wedding Crashers. You know, before you go, when I'm reading this, I'm saying to myself, is there a transferable lesson from this? Meaning, is this just a function of the world of art because of all the creative stuff and the, you know, the passions, or is this kind of thing apparent in many parts of the creative world?
I think it really is, and not just the creative world. I mean, I think it must apply in business and in anywhere, even in our sibling relations, right? I mean, it's interesting. I just think what I learned is how important it was for each of these artists to be yielding, to be kind of susceptible to the influence of the other. And what came from that was incredibly creative and productive. And then you get a kind of backlash, you get a kicking away, and that's where some of the drama happens, some of the explosive goings on. But, you know, in each case, they really mourned the loss of that rivalry. They felt that something had been kind of intensified and heightened in that time. And so when the other died or went away, there was a great sense of loss.
I learned a lot and I really loved it. Terrific.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Congratulations,
having me. I
Sebastian.
appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to finally meet you.